became next to impossible to get for parents to get their children returned to them, as hard as they might try and as well as they might be doing. We saw children aging out of foster care. We saw children going from foster care into youth homes, from youth homes into juvenile detention, and then from juvenile detention into adult prisons. So it was a heartbreaking trajectory, and I know that Illinois can do better. More recently, in 2019, Colette Payne, who's also a justice-involved individual and an amazing mom who's doing extraordinary advocacy nationwide as well as in Illinois, put together a bill to make a difference in how judges look at sentencing and pretrial decisions when a parent is involved. This was based in part on a report that was issued by the Annie E. Casey Foundation called A Shared Sentence, and then other research that just was becoming more available that illustrated pretty dramatically how harmful it is in lasting ways for young children to be separated from their parent. And what that does to a developing brain. So I'm going to go into the slide presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the reasons why this law was passed and how it works. There's some participatory defense here that the community can have a role in educating courts about this, especially if you know the family, mainly if you know the family. And I think it's one of the most hopeful things that we could do, because there are still thousands of parents locked up in Illinois for relatively minor offenses that would be better treated in the community. And I know we've got some people from problem-solving courts here. You've probably seen how that can work. So I'm going to find my slideshow thing. There we go. Is everybody seeing the mitigation under the Children's Best Interest Act?
Yep.
Thanks. So the basic purpose is to reduce harm to children, families, and communities, reduce crime, and support safer neighborhoods. If we keep parents with their children, we reduce crime. There's just a lot of research backing this up, and there's just really no question about that. We want to support secure parental attachment, and we want to promote healthy child development. So the act was passed and signed in 2019, and it took effect January 1st, 2020, right before COVID hit. So probably most of you know, the intense difficulties that courts around the country, but we know how it played out in Illinois, that, it was just very difficult. They were figuring out how to hold court without spreading the virus. They were figuring out Zoom. They were figuring out, ways to move forward. And a lot of people didn't get sentenced on nearly the time frame you would expect. And it also delayed a lot of training that normally would have taken place. It's never automatic when a new law passes. We're seeing this right now with the Pretrial Fairness Act. But this was a little bit more intense in terms of delayed implementation. So we know that around the state, many judges have not become aware of this. A lot of defense attorneys aren't even aware of it. And so we put together a project to make sure that this is getting fully implemented and used as intended. We want parents in every community who are facing charges to know that they have a right for their children's needs to be considered. We want them to ask their defense counsel to submit a family impact statement. And we want their families and pediatricians and childcare providers to be able to weigh in on that. This is what kind of parent this is. Yes, we know that they may be pleading guilty to this charge, but here's who else they are. And here's why this particular child needs their parent to remain in their lives. The law doesn't say anything about mandatory minimum prison sentences. What we've often been able to do once the defense has the information that they need is that they're able to negotiate some charges being reduced. Oftentimes charges are excessive for what the person, what the state could actually prove. So we sometimes ask for some charges to be dismissed or reduced in order to be able to fit within community sentencing. And anybody who has family responsibilities should be asking their defense counsel about this. Our project is consulting statewide with pretty much any defense attorney who calls us. So the Centers for Disease Control defines parents' incarceration as an ACE. I'm not going to assume that everybody on here knows about ACEs, but many studies over many years show that the more traumatic events that happen to us in childhood, the more harmful to our physical and mental health. And this is a lot about toxic stress. When our system floods with cortisol, I think most people are coming to understand the connection between physical health and mental health, right, and behavioral health. But when cortisol is in our systems day after day, because I'm 3 years old and I've never been without my father before, you know, and he used to tuck me in every night and read me a story, and where is he? He's gone. That kind of stress, when it's not alleviated quickly, starts to affect brain development. And brain development controls organ development. And so we see adults who had substantial trauma in childhood who now have asthma or COPD, who have diabetes, who have certain kinds of cancer, who have heart disease. And then we also see the behavioral impact of that. We see a lot of depression. We see suicidality. We see drug use. And you can see the whole list here. There's a lot of research on this. There's a link on this page, and I will send the slides to Toy afterwards. But we've also seen this on the ground. We've seen even children who were cared for by relatives and not in the system just have a really hard time concentrating in school, you know, getting into relationships because they have feelings of abandonment, just having real trouble as they grow up and into adulthood. Because that first relationship with your parents has a huge impact on how you relate and whether you find the world a place to be trusted. So this is a very conservative estimate, and it hasn't been updated since 2016, but at least 186,000 children in Illinois have suffered from parental incarceration. Many of them are under age 5. And we know that parental incarceration pushes families further into poverty, and that has a destabilizing impact on the entire neighborhood and the entire community. Many, many parents are being still sent to prison for low-level offenses. This is true for dads and moms, but it's particularly stark for women. And you may know that women's incarceration skyrocketed about 800% in Illinois. Could people mute themselves if you're, please?
You're on mute.
So 77% of mothers in IDOC over the past 30 years have been there for class 3 and class 4 felonies that should be eligible for probation, and a significant proportion of dads as well.
Oops.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Go ahead. Sorry about that.
I appreciate the gesture and what you were doing.
Sorry,
actually.
go ahead.
You know, but there's just no excuse to rely exclusively on prison for low-level offenses like this when we know that we're doing harm that is likely to increase crime, both for that parent and then in the next generation as well. Sorry, picking a little bit. Okay, so here's the most basic provision of the law. It's two main points. The defendant has a right to prevent a family impact statement, which the court shall consider, not may consider. The court has to consider it prior to imposing any sentence. And it may include testimony from family and community members, written statements, video, and documentation. So we're requiring the judge to look at the children's needs and look at what kind of parent this is. And then the second piece of that is that unless the court finds that the parent poses a significant risk to the community that outweighs the risk of harm from the parent's removal from the family, the court shall impose a sentence in accordance with the mitigation factors that allows the parent to continue to care for the child or children. So under this law, courts should be doing everything they can to keep families intact when there's not a serious, significant risk to the community from that parent. I think we have a long way to go till that is reality. So it adds two factors in mitigation to the general sentencing law. The first is that the defendant is the parent of a child or infant whose well-being will be negatively affected. And the second is if the defendant serves as a caregiver for a relative who is ill, disabled, or elderly. Now, we know that in almost every case, the children are going to be negatively affected by the parent's absence. And we know this because there's a lot of research around foster care placement that shows that children are harmed. So again, I think we're kind of at the threshold of some very major shift in understanding and shift in narrative in hopefully moving from a country that is extremely punitive in how we deal with criminal charges, particularly low-level charges, to a country that has some common sense and some compassion for how this impacts families, and also some common sense about what kind of sentencing can actually help someone get back on their feet and continue to be a good parent. Here are the factors. You know, really, you should never separate an infant who is breastfeeding from the parent. The age of the child is a consideration, with strong consideration to not disrupt the caregiving of babies, preschool, and school-age children. You know, if the parent is managing that education, getting that child to school, supervising homework, we really want to try to not put in a substitute to do that. The role of the parent in the child's day-to-day medical and educational needs. Is this parent the one who knows how to run the asthma nebulizer and reassures the child when they're having an asthma attack? The relationship. You know, what would the child say about where they want to be and whether they want their parent home with them? Any special needs, so any kind of medical or educational or psychological needs. The role of the parent and the financial support of the child. So, you know, what happens if a parent who was working is suddenly not there to support the family? in most cases that I've seen, that family is pushed into much deeper poverty and much greater desperation. This is the one factor that was already in the statute. I think most of us know that that has not been honored in most sentencing hearings. G, the likelihood that the child will be adjudged a dependent minor. In other words, that the child would go into foster care. I think we're starting to recognize that even a foster care system that does things better than Illinois has been doing, it doesn't do any favors by separating children from their parents. There are better ways to deal with the kinds of neglect, and which basically often looks like poverty, right? We could actually address the poverty instead of splitting up the family. And then just the best interest of the child. So initially, this law also addressed pretrial detention, but because the Pretrial Fairness Act was on the cusp of being passed, we were persuaded that opponents would use this law as a reason to argue against ending cash bail for poor people throughout the state, and say, well, if we can have a carve out for parents, we don't really need to change the law. So with that in mind, we amended it, and at the same time, a companion law was passed that created a task force. And if you go to the recommendations of the task force on children of incarcerated parents, you will see that there is a very strong recommendation that children have to be considered pretrial. Even a couple of days, if you think about it, can completely upend that child's life. Because if the parent's not there to pick that child up from daycare or school, very strong likelihood that that child is going to be sent to an emergency foster home, and then they may never be able to reunite. So we don't want parents held pretrial if they're not a serious risk to the community. And again, just that the domino effects of a parent losing their employment if they can't show up for work, their housing, and any public benefits. It is disruptive in ways that increase poverty and arguably also increase low-level criminal offenses. So watch out for landmines. This does not apply to every parent in the whole world. Occasionally, there are situations where if you raise the issue of the children's needs, there's some evidence in there somewhere that this parent had never lived with the child, has never supported the child, and the judge is going to be furious. So you always just have to make sure that this is very fact-based. And this always has to go through the defense attorney. No one should ever try to independently talk to the judge. All of this needs to be coordinated through the public defender or private attorney who is representing that parent. That's always your first stop when you're talking about this. So we have a list of excerpts from some of the research on the brain science that we can send out. We have workshops for community members, not only a workshop that's like this, but a workshop of how do you do a good family impact statement? What does that take, and how do you coordinate it? And we do those workshops via Zoom, jointly with a staff member of the Cook County Public Defenders in Community Engagement Team. And then we also do a lot of one-on-one work with families, helping them put together a good letter, helping them put together a photo narrative, working with the parent to figure out who are good witnesses in terms of your children's well-being and what kind of a parent you've been. So what I'd really like to talk about, and maybe we hear from Langston first and then come back to this discussion, but I'd really like to think about all of the folks here who are from vibrant organizations in Bloomington and nearby, what could your role be in promoting awareness of this law? I got a call just last week from a defense attorney who had just heard about this from their client for the first time. We've done a lot of workshops for defense counsel, not only in Cook County, but also in other parts of the state. And I have to say your chief public defender for McLean County was someone who pulled us into the statewide public defenders conference last summer. So we're working on it, but there's a lot of people out there who need to learn about this. Are there ways that you can support family integrity and keep parents with their children while they're serving their sentence or pretrial or both? And how can you spread the word? How can you make sure the people who need to know about this know about this? I also should just mention that we have had a couple of cases where people going in for resentencing, for a sentence reduction, also used this to, talk about how their children were doing in their absence. And we did get some reduction of sentence based on that. And I think I'll stop my screen share and see what Toy wants to do. We could take questions or we could and do discussion. It sounds like we maybe want to hear from Langston first.
Yes, thank you, Gail. We're going to come back to Gail for questions and discussion. But first of all, I want to bring Langston to the table, because once Gail was presented, Langston actually, well, I'll let him tell his story, but Langston actually went through this as a child and he went through this as an adult. So I'm going to turn over to Langston to share his story, and then we'll go back to Gail for questions and discussion. Langston?
Hey, guys. I thank you guys all for your attention. I told you briefly earlier that I spent a majority of my adult life incarcerated, in federal prison and in state prison. But the first time I stepped foot on a maximum security prison yard, I was 4 years old. And it was in the 1980s. Prison is a little different nowadays, but it was in the 1980s. And my father had been sentenced to 40 years to life in prison when I was 2 years old. And it was pretty normal for us to go visit him. I was blessed enough not to go into any type of foster care or anything. I was still in the care of my mother. But I'm a biracial young man, and in the 80s, I was being raised as America sees me, a black man in the United States, by a white woman. And I was taught to navigate this world by a Caucasian woman. And that is a barrier. Believe it or not, her and I are not the same, and the world doesn't look at us the same. And she was left to teach me how to navigate this world. She would drive us to Pontiac Correctional Facility every weekend. We had an amazing relationship with our father, who was serving his time there. But I can say there were a lot of traumatic experiences that I didn't really understand how traumatic they were until I got older. I remember that 45-minute ride to Pontiac. I remember pulling up in front of the prison and seeing the big stone-capped, razor barbed wire fences. And I remember seeing the guards, gripping their sniper rifles and kind of glaring down at the vehicles as they drove through. I remember asking my mother, are those men gonna shoot us? And I remember her having to explain to me that no, those guns weren't for us. They were for the men inside. And then I had to wrap my mind around, well, are they gonna shoot my daddy? And she had to explain to us that, no, they're not going to shoot your daddy as long as he doesn't do anything that he's not supposed to. And in the 80s in Pontiac, they would have picnics. You could go and you could be on the yard with your family and you could bring dishes of food. The prison's a lot different now. But there were a lot of things that I saw, sexual acts but between men and women, on those picnics, just sitting there sharing a meal with my father, and those same sniper rifle guys are walking around, and I'm old enough to read at this point, and there's signs that saying if you get out of line, you'll be shot. I remember becoming accustomed to the security procedures, being patted down, and people, rubbing their hands on my inner thighs and under my waistband, and having to take my shoes off and look in my mouth. And, I never really understood what it was all for. I understood that it was so we didn't sneak anything in here that would hurt our father and his friends. But I couldn't understand why anybody thought that we would sneak something in here to hurt our dad. Um, these things created a lot of trauma within me growing up. And at the same time, it made me comfortable with a prison yard, which made me not look at prison as, an ultimate punishment to crime. And as a young man learning to navigate this world, as a man on his own with just a mother, I started to make my own bad decisions. And I got involved in the sale of marijuana, and I landed myself in federal prison. I came home and I had lost my identity completely, and I got involved in substance abuse. I become a drug addict, and my troubles with the law just continued. And I reached a point, you guys, where I then became the father who was incarcerated with his family coming to see him. And I also got involved with DCFS. There was a point in time where I had violated my federal supervised release. I was fighting a state case with the state of Illinois. I was going through family court, custody, family court for a open Department of Child and Family Services case for neglect for my substance abuse. And I think I even had like a workman's comp case at the time. I was going to court, you guys, more times a week than like an average public defender. On top of that, I had to do, parenting classes. I had to go to substance abuse treatment, anger management classes. I was supposed to keep some sort of a job in between all of this and provide a place to live. I had to get a place to live that had a bedroom for both my son and my daughter if I wanted to get them returned to me. And I'll tell you what, guys, I didn't make it. I failed. I ended up, taking some time on the state case. My parental rights were revoked. I did a lot of the things that they wanted me to do. I kept a job just enough to, get some type of place for us to live. And I did all these classes in court and all of these things, but my sobriety was not high on that priority list. My stress levels were so high, and I really didn't have any help. The way that I had become involved with DCFS was that I called them. My child's mother and myself were both involved in the use of illegal drugs, and I was in over my head, and I needed help with my children. I knew I needed help, and I called the Department of Child and Family Services and asked for their help. And they removed my kids. They put them in protective custody, and I never got my kids back from that. The steps that I had to take, though I put myself in that situation, I take full responsibility for being in that situation. I didn't get much help, and I didn't get much guidance in prioritizing the things. If I hadn't done any of that other stuff, but I had remained sober along the way, I would have gotten more time to finish some of those things. But it would explain to me like some of those other things were more important than my sobriety. And it just became so overwhelming that my kids were permanently taken away from me. I ended up back in the United States Penitentiary. I had to serve more time, and I had to then go to a state penitentiary, serve time there, and then come home. And since then, I have positioned myself. I'm now a business owner, and I own a moving company here in Central Illinois, and I've bought a house across the street from my mother, and I have a relationship with my kids again. I'll never be their custodial, by law father again, but their maternal grandparents were able to adopt them while I was gone. And she has, you know, just she's been proud of me for what I've been able to accomplish, and she's been allowed me to spend time with my kids again. And it's gone from, you know, some visitation and going to the park to, you know, them spending the night to me now being a homeowner and having their own rooms. And, you know, they come spend a week or two with me now. And I'm very involved in their lives. And I had to do a lot of soul searching and a lot of fighting to get there. And me personally, I'm just here to help the next person, because I am one of those people in those statistics that Gail told us about. I'm included in that all the way from the beginning into who I am now. The term justice involved individual is running all through me, you guys, from day one. And so I'm here to just help the next guy that's going through any of this, you know, a guy that's got children, men or women, that have children that are incarcerated or are now home, and, you know, just looking to do the things to get their kids back, or just anything at all, to share my story and to help along the way. And so I thank you guys just for taking the time to listen. It's one of the hardest things for me that there is to talk about. You know, I can talk about my drug addictions, I can talk about my felonies, and, you know, my time in prison, and all the things I did to build my life back up. But until recently, it was really even hard for me to admit that I had lost my kids, and that I'm not their parental father, you know, by law. And the state of Illinois, you know, the dad's got a fight on his hands when it comes to parental rights sometimes, more so than the mom even sometimes. And so I'm here. I'm here to help. I'm here, you know, if it, you know, for questions of, you know, how did you do this? How did you overcome this barrier? You know, what did this look like for you? I'm always here to share those things and to answer any questions. So I thank you guys, and you know, good luck to anybody that's going through the things that I've been through, both as a child and as an adult, with children.
Thank you,
Thank
Langston. I
you.
really appreciate that. Go ahead, Gail.
Amazing clarity and amazing courage. Thank you, Langston.
Yeah,
I
thank you.
I
Thank
thank
you.
you. I thank you, Gail, and I want to know that I love the fact that you put so much emphasis on the proof of burden on the parent to prove their support. You know, you're gonna have a lot of men and women jumping up and down in front of the judge, trying to anyway, saying, "Hey, I have kids." You know, there's a new law passes, and everybody in prison thinks that, you know, it's gonna relate to them. And there's going to be a lot of people jumping up in front of the judge that haven't been in their child's life, that are going to try to get some type of mitigating factor on their sentence or something. And I love the fact that they got to put some type of proof beyond just having kids, you know, to benefit from those mitigating factors. That's amazing.
Wow. Well, I'm gonna turn it over for questions
And
regarding
can
Gail.
I just
Go
want to
ahead.
add one quick comment. You know, we have many more requests from mothers than from dads. And I think that immediate impact of a mom being I mean, you guys know when when if mom's the main disciplinarian, mom takes off and all hell breaks loose, right? I mean, it's just it is and it's more common for children to have to move into a different household when it's their mom who goes to prison. But at the same time, it is not okay for kids to grow up without their dads. They need their dads too. And, you know, we're seeing that with a couple of our advisory board members whose lives were dramatically changed because their dads couldn't be there with them. So, including one young woman who she had to start working when she was 16, and she couldn't take part in after school stuff. She could, you know, she couldn't have a social life. She's just now getting a nursing degree. She thought that she would be out of college and getting a master's by now, but it's really held her back. And also just building a relationship with her dad when she didn't have him for those years. It's, you know, it's really, it's really important that we not undervalue that parental relationship.
Thank you, Gail. Anybody else have any other questions for what Gail presented or questions for Langston? This is a very, very, very good topic question to talk about. Chris?
One of the things that I think is an aspect of all of this is how little most people know about this. You know, I think our perceptions of who has parents in prison and who doesn't is widely askew. I mean, last year, the project that we did at Wesleyan, you know, the statistic that 1 out of every 15 American children has a parent in prison is a pretty staggering statistic. And one of the things that was interesting to me is that in doing the interviews we did is how many Wesleyan students have parents in prison. Whereas all of those students that we interviewed that had a parent in prison basically felt they couldn't talk about it, basically felt like nobody would understand. And so all of those students that talked to the interviewees and talked to me all talked about how none of their friends, none of their sorority sisters, or none of their fraternity brothers, or any of their teachers knew about any of this stuff. And when I would mention to other faculty and administrators that we had several students that had a parent who was in the criminal justice system, they were shocked. And I think that this law may open that up a bit, but at the same time, the stigma of having a parent in prison and I mean, Langston, you went through it on both ends. I think that's part of the issue that we don't really talk about this, so no one really thinks it's a problem, but it really is.
I think that's a really important point. You know, also, we're a culture that blames the individual always, and we never look at the policy that puts people in these positions, and just the systems. So, you know, it's not to say take away individual accountability. Of course, we all need to be responsible, but let's also look at community accountability and government accountability. It has to be a balance of both, or people can't make it.
One of the things, you guys, that I know that affected me tremendously, and I want to speak on this because there's going to be some people that are sentenced, right? And they might get some mitigating factors on their sentence because they have children, and they'll be able to get home earlier, but they still got to go. You know, they still have to go. And
Not always.
Well, not always. I said, but there's going to be some. There's going to be some parents that still have to go to prison. They're still going to need to go, whether it's a year or two. It might not be 30, but parenting from prison is a lot harder than parenting from home. And there's unhealthy things that happen between parents and children in their communication. I remember reaching a point in my young as a young man where I didn't want to talk to my dad on the phone anymore. It was no longer fun to talk to him because he was gonna complain about my grades. He was gonna try to do all this parenting stuff in a 15-minute conversation. I don't want to hear it. And on top of that, he's gonna ask me a bunch of questions about what my mom's doing and all these things. And now I'm in the middle of all this stuff. And it was very uncomfortable and it was very weird. You know, it got weird. And so, you know, even the parents who are allowed to, you know, benefit some mitigating factors on their sentence, they're going to need some help understanding what parenting looks like now from the inside.
And it needs to be done in a way that is not insulting. So Osborne Association in New York has amazing programs for parents. Young woman that I know just says, they gave my dad back to me. You know, he was gone. We talked on the phone, but he was gone from me. And so, yeah, I mean, there are places around the country who know how to do this well. I don't think there's a group in Illinois that I feel does it well, but there are good models. So
we're going to do Michelle and then Linda. Michelle, then Linda. Michelle?
Yes. So I just had a couple of questions for Gail. And you may have mentioned this, does the age of the child matter?
Yes, that's one of the very first factors.
Okay.
So younger children of course, you know, suffer dramatic stress when they're separated. But also school-age children, but yeah, I mean, if they're infants or toddlers, they absolutely should not be separated from their primary caregiver, or a parent who's been day-to-day hands-on.
Right.
Unless it's absolutely necessary for the safety of the community.
Gotcha. And a follow-up question, if there's another parent in the situation, would that negate this?
I would say no, it shouldn't negate it. It will be considered. It will be part of the balance that the judge is going to look at. You know, but it shouldn't negate it, because children need both parents.
Yes, they do. And kind of to speak to that, we just heard from the Stevenson Center, which is a research lab here at ISU, and they published some research that spoke to the fact that the kids that they followed that became incarcerated had no father involvement in their lives. And so that just kind of backs up what you've been saying. That's it.
Linda?
Well, thank you for all of those great responses. And maybe I missed this part of it, is that how do you determine, you know, which parent would be a good candidate to bring that child back in their lives? You know what I mean? Especially when you have repeat offenders. You know, we always want to give people second chances and opportunity to do better. But how do you make that determination is number one. And then how do you prepare that parent? And sometimes you need to do both parents, whether, you know, one is locked up, another one isn't. How do you enable them to be able to work together on being a parent and when one is away?
It's a great question. So our focus right now is on getting this law implemented and getting family impact statements written and in front of judges. So the other piece of it, the pieces of it that you're talking about, we're trying to refer to other organizations. So there's a number. I'm more familiar with Chicago because I've, you know, lived in Chicago most of my life, but there are organizations that will work on getting parents to work together, you know, and how destructive it is to badmouth the other parent, or, you know, use the child to spy on them, that kind of stuff. You know, there are a lot of organizations in the community that work on this. In terms of assessing a case on the front end for us, our first question is to the defense counsel, you know, is this a good strategy for this person in this, you know, who's facing these criminal charges? Because they're going to have a sense of, this won't work in this case because they have blah, blah, blah in their past, or in their recent past, particularly. I would never say that we wouldn't use this in a situation where a parent has a criminal history, if the parent has been living with the child and actively involved in the child. It could be a dad who's been employed and been visiting on weekends and taking the kids to their sports games and stuff, but slipped up and relapsed. That doesn't mean that father isn't critical in that child's life. And in some cases where a parent has been working a service plan, just on the verge of getting the child back, and now they're facing new charges. We had a case like that in Champaign. And in some ways, actually, COVID worked in her favor because her case was so delayed that she had a 2-year period where she completed treatment, worked hard at sustaining sobriety, had a stable job, cared for her kids, you know, had assistance from Win Recovery, which is an amazing, actually one of the model sentencing program. It's not a sentencing program, but one of the models that we use to suggest a way of keeping parents in the community. she did so well with them, and she had a housing voucher for them, so that by the time her sentencing came up, it would have just been unthinkable. I mean, just incredibly cruel for the state to send her to prison. And in her case, the state's attorney was persuaded to drop one of the charges that had a mandatory 10-year sentence. So it can be done, but she worked really, really hard, and she worked really hard to help her children overcome the trauma that they had experienced when she was in jail, because they were with relatives, but they were not cared for in the way they needed to be cared for while she was away. So she had a lot of work to do to regain their trust and build, good habits, and they had missed lots of doctor's appointments. That's another finding of some of the most recent research, is that kids who do not have their moms end up only going to the emergency room when it's gotten so bad that. So yeah, but we are assessing a very individualized, asking the parent about their recent time in their family, and then asking for people who can back that up. So
thank you so much. We tend to work with people who we know, because you have those relationships, you have the background, and I know that there are those that get, that don't get the attention that the ones that possibly should have as well. So I'm just interested in ensuring that, how do we make sure that we catching everybody?
Yeah.
Because the system is catching everybody.
That's a really,
and it's not
question.
necessarily all positive,
So I'll tell you what we've done is we've put flyers up in the jail. What that has meant is that we have mostly been getting requests from people who have more serious cases, because the people who are out in the community are a little less likely to have encountered us. We're on the verge of working on that. We're going to be leafleting outside the courtrooms. We do already have in the bond or front end courtrooms flyers available that the public defender can give to people. And the fact that we've done so much training with defense counsel, hopefully, gives us a leg up, at least gets us started on the path of having this available to everybody. Right now, I'm the only staff person. We're this close to having enough funding to hire a second staff person. We should have 20, if we were really gonna consult with everybody who needed a workshop on how to do this well. But I don't see that. I don't see 20 happening anytime soon.
Right.
So
let me just say this last comment about Langston's. That's a powerful name. And it fits you.
Yes.
And you need to ride with that name. That's a powerful name that you have. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. My mother named me Langston Marcus, and she named me after Langston Hughes and Marcus Garvey.
Wow.
And so I have some big shoes to fill, and I'm a mover. I'm a furniture mover, and I feel like God put me on this earth to move people in the physical form and in the mental and social. And so everything that I went and overcame and I endured in my life, I believe it was for a reason, you guys. And it's so I can be here in this form now and helping give back and teach and be here for some of these young men and women that didn't have the guidance that I have.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Any other questions?